The year was 1893, a year that would be remembered not for triumph or progress, but for something else, something hidden in a single photograph, something that carried with it the weight of a haunting. Her name was Catherine Doyle. She was 9 years old, a child born into a time of hardship, disease, and superstition. Most children of her age left behind little more than names carved into fading gravestones, their lives forgotten, swallowed by the years. But Catherine, she left behind an image, a single photograph, a photograph that should not exist. Look closely at it. At first, it seems ordinary. A plain Victorian portrait, faded with time. The girl sits in a stiff wooden chair, her back straight, her dress simple, her shoes worn from too many walks on the same dirt roads. Behind her hangs the dull, hand-painted canvas backdrop that every photographer used in that era. Everything about it feels familiar, another relic of the 19th century. But then you see it. Her face. Her smile. In the unsettling history of Victorian photography, smiling children were almost unheard of. The long exposure times meant subjects had to remain absolutely still, their expressions frozen and blank. Smiling was impractical, and it was also seen as improper. Photographs were serious records, not fleeting moments of joy. Many of these old photos show children in stiff poses, their faces pale, their eyes vacant, their bodies sometimes those of the dead, captured in disturbing images known as post-mortem photography. And so Catherine's smile should not be there. It feels wrong. It feels as though the image itself is mocking the solemnity of the age. The corners of her lips curl upwards just slightly, but enough to unsettle. Some who saw the photograph swore her smile was not one of happiness, but of knowledge, of knowing something that no child should ever know. The town whispered. They always whispered. The Doyle family was already strange, already marked as different. Their home was set apart from the others, a sagging two-story house with crooked shutters and a chimney that rarely smoked. At night, neighbors claimed they heard muttering inside, strange words, a forbidden language that no one could quite identify. The Doyles did not welcome visitors. The curtains were always drawn. The children rarely played outside, and yet Catherine, with her haunting smile, was always seen near the edge of the graveyard, her little feet wandering between the headstones as if she belonged among them. Old women shook their heads when she passed. Men crossing the street would avoid her eyes. They said she was touched, cursed, or worse. They said she smiled at things no one else could see. Some believed she had been born under an ill omen. Others whispered she was marked, chosen by something dark that had been following the Doyle family for generations. But still, the photograph was taken. A portrait meant to capture her likeness forever. And forever it did. At first, only the family saw it. The parents tucked the small cabinet card into a drawer, as was common in those days. But when visitors came, when curious eyes found it lying on a table, the photograph began to spread its unease. People who looked at it swore they felt a chill crawl down their spines. Some claimed that her smile grew wider the longer they stared at it. Others said there was a shadow behind her, a faint blur, shaped like a hand on her shoulder, a hand that no one remembered being there. It became one of those images that was passed around the town in whispers, like a secret too heavy to keep. Mothers warned their children not to look at it too long. Some swore the photo was cursed, that it carried with it the fate of vanished children and lost souls. Then, the rumors deepened. People began to claim that Catherine herself was acting strangely after the photograph was taken. She was seen talking to herself in the fields, her head tilted, listening to voices only she could hear. She laughed in church, softly at first, then louder, as though mocking the prayers of the faithful. Her smile became her defining trait, an eerie reminder of that photograph. And then came the night whispers grew into terror. Autumn. The year still 1893. Catherine went missing. No one knows the exact moment she vanished. Some say she went to bed, her smile the last thing her mother saw. Others believe she was seen walking near the edge of the bog, clutching her doll, humming a tune that no one recognized. Wherever she went, she never returned. The family panicked. The town searched. Lanterns lit up the woods, the rivers, the empty cottages. Her name was shouted into the darkness, but only the echo answered back. Days passed, then weeks. Her shoe was found at the edge of the marsh, sinking into the mud. But Catherine herself was gone. The child who smiled had vanished forever. The photograph remained. That was all. An unsettling image, frozen in time, holding the last trace of a girl who no longer existed. A disturbing artifact of forgotten events, a chilling reminder of unsolved mysteries that refused to die. The image would outlive everyone who searched for her, everyone who whispered about her, and perhaps, if you believe the stories, it would carry with it the hidden truth of her disappearance. The year was 1893, and this is how it began. The Doyle family was not like the others. In the late 1800s, most families in small towns lived with doors open, neighbors close, and stories shared across fences and cobblestone streets. But the Doyles they kept to themselves. Their home stood on the edge of town, separated from the rest, surrounded by a thicket of twisted trees that seemed to lean inward as if hiding the house from curious eyes. It was not a welcoming place. The shutters hung crooked. The roof sagged under years of neglect. No lamps glowed in the windows after nightfall. To walk past it was to feel a sudden chill, as though you had stepped into the shadow of something ancient and waiting. Locals called it a haunted place, but never too loudly. To speak of the Doyle house, they said, was to invite its secrets into your own. The father, Thomas Doyle, was a man of few words. Broad-shouldered, stern-faced, and silent, he worked at the mill during the day, returning each evening with a rigid, almost mechanical routine. He spoke little to his neighbors, and when he did, his words felt rehearsed, clipped, cold. Some swore he had a temper, though no one dared confront him. Others said they had heard him whispering in the night, whispering in a language no one recognized. A forbidden language, guttural and sharp, spilling out of the darkened house when the wind shifted just right. The mother, Eliza, was different, but no less unsettling. Deeply religious, she walked with a Bible pressed tightly to her chest, her lips moving constantly in silent prayer. She was seen lighting candles in the windows, muttering over them, then blowing them out one by one. Some claimed she practiced rituals not of the church, but of something older, something far more sinister. To the town, she was either pious or cursed. No one could decide which. The children were shadows of their parents. Catherine, of course, stood apart with her smile, but she was not an only child. She had two brothers, Samuel and Daniel, both older, both rarely seen. They worked with their father in silence, their faces pale, their eyes sunken, their presence unsettling. They avoided town gatherings, avoided laughter, avoided light. When they did appear, their gazes lingered too long, and people felt an unease they could not explain. Neighbors whispered that the Doyle children were forbidden from mingling with others. They never joined in games, never played in the square, never sang with the other children. Their world was the house, the woods, and whatever strange practices took place within those shuttered walls. But it was Catherine who drew the most attention. She was different even from her brothers. She smiled when she shouldn't. She spoke when no one else was there. She sang little rhymes that twisted into eerie melodies. And yet, she seemed untouched by fear. Some believed she had inherited her father's stern silence, but transformed it into something far more disturbing. A knowing grin, a look that suggested she understood secrets no child should ever hold. And then there was the family's reputation. Strange things seemed to follow them. Livestock dying without cause. Crops withering near their land, while others flourished elsewhere. Visitors who claimed they saw shadows move across the upstairs windows when the entire family was downstairs. Disturbing images carved into the bark of trees behind the house, symbols no one recognized. Some said the Doyle family was cursed. Others believed they carried a secret that had been passed down for generations, one rooted in an unsettling history no one dared uncover. The photograph of Catherine only fueled the town's suspicion. That smile, fixed in time, seemed to embody everything people feared about the Doyles. They said it was proof proof that the family was different, proof that Catherine had been touched by something unnatural. Families whispered that to look at her picture too long was to invite her fate. And yet, no one could stop talking about it. It wasn't just Catherine's smile that disturbed them. It was her family's silence. When she vanished, the Doyles spoke little. Thomas said only that she must have wandered too far. Eliza wept, yes, but some claimed her tears were hollow, her cries too rehearsed. And her brothers? They said nothing at all. Their faces were expressionless, as though their sister had never existed. Some townsfolk whispered that the Doyles knew exactly what had happened to Catherine, that her disappearance was no accident, but a consequence of the family's dark rituals, of the forbidden language that spilled through their walls at night. Others believed Catherine had been sacrificed, offered up to whatever haunted their bloodline, to whatever secret they carried in silence. But if that were true, then why keep her photograph? Why allow her smile to remain frozen forever? Was it a token of guilt, a warning? Or was it something far more sinister, an image meant to outlast her body, meant to remind the world of the chilling secrets the Doyles could never bury? The house still stands in fragments today, rotting, collapsing into the earth. But those who pass by swear it still carries a presence. Some say they hear whispers through the broken beams. Others claim they see a flicker of light in the windows, though the house has been abandoned for decades. And always, they speak of Catherine, the child who smiled when no one else did, the child who vanished into the folds of her family's secrets. The Doyle family was strange. That much is undeniable. But the true nature of their secrets has never been revealed, and perhaps it is better that way. For if the truth were uncovered, it may prove darker than anyone could bear. The year was still 1893, but to understand Catherine Doyle's disappearance, you must first understand the town itself. A town where shadows seemed to linger too long, where faith and fear lived side by side, and where superstition shaped every whispered story. This was no bustling city. It was a place of cobblestone streets, crooked houses, and fields that stretched into fog. The church bells marked the passing of time, but it was not the sound of salvation. It was the sound of ritual, of a town that clung desperately to its beliefs to keep the darkness away. Superstition was the lifeblood of the people. Children were warned not to walk alone at night, lest the fair ones take them away. Windows were covered in black cloth when someone died, to keep spirits from re-entering the house. Coins were placed in the mouths of the dead to pay for safe passage to the other side. Even the act of sweeping at night was forbidden, for fear of sweeping one's luck away forever. But beneath these everyday customs, darker beliefs thrived. The people whispered of creatures in the woods, thin shadows that walked just beyond the tree line. They spoke of banshees whose cries foretold death, and of changelings, children swapped by unseen hands with something not quite human. To outsiders, these were only stories, fragments of folklore. But to the townsfolk, they were truth. And when Catherine Doyle began to smile in places no child should smile, those whispers grew louder. They said she was touched by the other world, that her grin was a mark of something unnatural. They recalled seeing her alone in the graveyard, standing among the rows of leaning stones. Her lips curled upward as though she was greeting old friends. Some even swore she spoke to them, murmuring to the names carved into crumbling markers, as if answering voices no one else could hear. The church noticed, too. Father Brennan, the parish priest, tried to speak with Catherine's mother. He suggested prayer. He suggested discipline. But Eliza Doyle only smiled faintly, clutching her Bible tighter, refusing to acknowledge the whispers. The priest grew uneasy, and from the pulpit he warned his flock that sin wears many faces, even the innocent. Though he never named Catherine directly, everyone knew. Soon the stories multiplied. A neighbor claimed Catherine had been heard humming a forbidden language, the same strange syllables that sometimes slipped from her father's lips at night. Another swore she had seen Catherine standing in the orchard after dusk, her face illuminated by the moon, her smile stretching wider than it should have. When approached, the girl vanished into the shadows, leaving only the sound of laughter. Superstition turned suspicion into fear. Families began locking their doors earlier. Children were warned not to play near the Doyle's property. And when Catherine disappeared, those fears became certainty. For in the minds of the townsfolk, she had not simply wandered away. She had been taken. But by whom? Or by what? The bogs were said to be cursed, waters that swallowed men whole, leaving no trace. The forests, too, carried their own terrors. Lights that flickered between the branches, whispers that lured travelers off the path. And there were the old wells, long abandoned, that locals claimed were gateways, portals through which something ancient still stirred. The town believed Catherine had stumbled into one of these places, drawn by her strange smile, her unearthly joy, and that whatever waited there had claimed her. Still, not all believed in such tales. A few muttered that Catherine's family knew more than they admitted, that Thomas Doyle's harsh silence was guilt, that Eliza's prayers were not for salvation, but for concealment, and that the older brothers, Samuel and Daniel, had been seen digging behind the house in the days before Catherine vanished. A simple chore, or something far more sinister? Yet in this town, suspicion never needed proof. Superstition was enough, and so the story spread, growing with each telling, until Catherine was no longer a missing child but a warning. Parents spoke of her in hushed voices, telling their little ones not to wander, not to smile at strangers, not to answer voices in the dark. Catherine Doyle became a legend before her body was ever found, if it was ever found at all. And then there was the photograph. That cursed image of a smiling child passed quietly from hand to hand. Some swore the photo itself carried power, that it was a disturbing image linked to her fate. They claimed it showed eerie details unseen before. A faint shadow behind her, the suggestion of another face in the background, eyes that seemed to follow whoever stared too long. The photograph became part of the town's superstition, an object feared, a relic of forbidden truth. A town already haunted by its own myths now had a new one. Catherine Doyle was not just another vanished child. She was proof that the sinister past still lived among them, proof that the line between history and horror was far thinner than anyone dared to admit. But if the town was right, if superstition explained Catherine's disappearance, why did her family remain so silent? Why did the Doyles never fight to clear their name? Why did they let the whispers grow, unchecked, as though they too believed something had taken her? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the town, but in the house itself, in the chilling secrets of the Doyle family. The photograph of Catherine Doyle was unlike any other. It was supposed to be simple, a portrait taken in a modest studio, a keepsake for her family. But what it captured was far from ordinary. What it showed would become a piece of dark history, an image so disturbing that whispers of it never truly faded. At first glance, the photograph seems normal. A young girl sits on a wooden chair, her small frame swallowed by the stiff fabric of her dress. Her hair is neatly parted. Her shoes, though worn, are tied with care. Behind her is the painted canvas backdrop, cracked and faded, that countless families stood before to preserve their likenesses. It is ordinary in every way. But then you see it. Her face. Her smile. In the late 1800s, photography was not meant to capture joy. It was meant to capture permanence, stillness, memory. Smiling was rare, almost forbidden. Children were told to sit motionless, their expressions blank, their bodies rigid. Even the living often resembled the dead. And sometimes they truly were. Post-mortem photography was common, families posing with lifeless children to hold on to them just a little longer. These were photographs of silence, sorrow, and loss. And yet Catherine smiled. Not the soft, fleeting smile of innocence, but something else. Something lasting, unsettling, and out of place. Her lips curved just enough to seem unnatural. Her eyes held a glimmer that unsettled those who dared look too long. It was as if she was mocking the tradition itself, smiling in the face of something far darker. Neighbors who saw the image were disturbed. They whispered that no child should smile in such a way. Some swore her teeth were too sharp in the photograph, though others claimed that was only the shadow. Some said her eyes seemed to follow them, that the longer they stared, the more her smile seemed to widen. It became more than just an old photo. It became a disturbing image, a puzzle of eerie details, a piece of unsettling history that felt almost alive. And then there were the shadows. "Look closely," they said. "Behind Catherine, in the blurred backdrop, there is something else. A faint shape, darker than it should be." Some claimed it was the outline of a hand on her shoulder. Others swore it was the face of another child, watching from behind her. A face no one remembered being there. A face no one could explain. The rumors spread quickly. The photograph was whispered about in kitchens, in pews, in hushed tones after nightfall. Mothers refused to let their children see it. Some swore the photo carried a curse, that every family who touched it would know tragedy. A farmer who borrowed the image for a day to examine it lost 3 cows to sudden illness. A woman who stared at it too long claimed she saw Catherine's smile in her dreams, a smile that would not fade when she woke. The Doyles, for their part, never spoke of it. They did not display the photograph as families usually did. They kept it hidden, tucked away in a drawer, though somehow, copies began to circulate. No one admitted to making them, yet they appeared in town, handed quietly from one person to another, like a forbidden object. Each copy carried the same eerie details. Each one seemed to grow darker, as if the image itself was deteriorating into something unnatural. It was said the photograph should not exist, that it was wrong, cursed, even dangerous. Some townsfolk claimed Catherine's disappearance was tied to it, that the act of capturing her smile had sealed her fate, that by preserving it in the photograph, the family had trapped something they could not control. Over the years, the story of the photograph only grew darker. They said those who looked at it too long began to hear whispers, that Catherine's faint laugh could be heard in the silence of the room, that her eyes would blink when no one was watching. It was more than superstition. It was a creeping certainty that the photograph itself was haunted, a relic of a mysterious disappearance, and a piece of horror storytelling that refused to fade with time. And still, the most chilling question remained unanswered. Why had Catherine smiled? Was it innocence, rebellion, or something else entirely? Did she smile because she knew what was coming? Did she smile because she was not alone in that room? Or was it because she was already marked, her fate written long before the photograph was ever taken? The image of Catherine Doyle remains one of those disturbing mysteries that time cannot erase. A photograph that, by all rights, should not exist. A portrait that seems ordinary until you see the details. A haunting relic of a child who smiled and then vanished forever. But this was not the last strange event in Catherine's life. In the days leading to her disappearance, her behavior grew more unsettling, her smile more ominous. And what came next would prove that the photograph was not just a memory, but a warning. The final days of Catherine Doyle were anything but ordinary. Though she was only 9 years old, the people of the town said she had already begun to change. There was something in her eyes, something in the way her lips curved into that strange smile, that unsettled even those who pitied her. She seemed caught between the innocence of childhood and something far darker, something no child should ever carry. It began with the songs. Catherine had always loved to hum, but now her melodies twisted into something unnatural. She would sit on the steps of her home at dusk, clutching her worn doll, and sing nursery rhymes backward, her small voice carrying over the fields in tones that made grown men pause in their work. A neighbor once asked her what she was singing. Catherine simply smiled, tilted her head, and said, "It's the language they like." The Doyles pretended not to notice. Thomas Doyle, the stern father, grew more withdrawn, his silence heavier than ever. Eliza's prayers became more frantic, her voice trembling as she lit candles in the windows, only to snuff them out minutes later. And Catherine's brothers, Samuel and Daniel, seemed to avoid her altogether, as if afraid to even share a room with her. Strange drawings began to appear in the Doyle home. Childlike sketches, scratched into scraps of paper and even onto the walls. Figures with no faces, standing in rows. Trees with mouths instead of branches. A tall figure with hollow eyes, always drawn with its hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl. When asked about the sketches, Catherine only giggled. "He likes it when I draw him," she said. By now, the town's unease had grown into fear. Catherine was seen in the graveyard more often, wandering between the headstones, smiling as if greeting friends. Some swore she spoke to the dead, answering questions no one else could hear. Others claimed to see her standing perfectly still for hours, staring into the trees with that same fixed grin. A farmer who passed by one evening said Catherine turned toward him and whispered his name, though he had never spoken to her before. And then there were the nights. The Doyle's house seemed restless after dark. Neighbors reported flickers of candlelight in the windows at odd hours. Whispers carried through the walls, words in a forbidden language that no one understood. Some swore they heard Catherine laughing, high-pitched and sharp, long after the rest of the family was asleep. The day before her disappearance, Catherine was especially unsettled. Her mother tried to keep her indoors, but Catherine slipped out, wandering barefoot through the orchard with her doll. A neighbor's child, watching from a distance, claimed Catherine's lips were moving, but no sound came out. Then, all at once, she turned, smiled, and said, "Tomorrow, I'll smile forever." That night, the house was quiet, but only on the surface. Eliza Doyle was seen rushing between rooms with her Bible. Thomas sat motionless in his chair, staring into the fire. And Catherine sat at the window, her smile glowing faintly in the reflection of the glass. The next morning, she was gone. She rose early, clutching her doll tightly, and walked out the door without a word. Her mother would later recall that Catherine turned back just once, smiled, and whispered something she could not understand. And then she vanished into the fog. By midday, she had not returned. The search began, frantic and desperate. The townsfolk scoured the woods, their lanterns swinging in the autumn mist. They searched the rivers, the bogs, the abandoned cottages. For days, they combed the land, calling her name, their voices swallowed by the silence of the fields. But there was nothing. No trace of Catherine except a single shoe, found sinking into the mud at the edge of the bog. Her doll was never found. Her body was never found. The girl who smiled was gone. Her final days became legend, her eerie behavior remembered in every whispered retelling. The backward songs, the faceless drawings, the whispers in the night, and the chilling promise she made. "Tomorrow, I'll smile forever." Was it prophecy? Was it madness? Or was it a warning, a message she could not explain in any other way? No one knows. All that remains is the photograph, the cursed image of her unsettling smile, and the chilling truth that Catherine Doyle was not like other children. She was something else. Something lost in time, swallowed by shadows. And yet, as disturbing as her final days were, the day of her disappearance carried even darker details. Details the town would never forget. The day Catherine Doyle vanished was etched into the town's memory like a scar. It was the autumn of 1893. The morning air was heavy with mist, curling low across the fields, swallowing the horizon in pale white. The townsfolk would later say that even before the child disappeared, something about that day felt wrong. Birds were silent. Dogs refused to leave their porches. The air itself seemed charged, as if nature was holding its breath. Catherine rose before the sun. Her mother heard the faint creak of floorboards, the soft patter of bare feet across the wooden planks. But by the time Eliza Doyle stirred from her restless sleep, Catherine was already gone. The front door stood ajar, its iron latch swaying slightly as though touched by unseen hands. Her father, Thomas, did not react. He sat in his chair by the fireplace, staring into the embers, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When Eliza cried out that Catherine was missing, Thomas merely whispered, "It was bound to happen." By midday, panic spread through the town. Groups of men with lanterns and walking sticks gathered at the edge of the Doyle property. They began to comb the countryside, their voices cutting through the fog as they shouted her name. "Catherine! Catherine!" Their echoes came back hollow, carrying an eerie emptiness. The woods were the first place they searched. The twisted oaks stood silent, their branches heavy with mist. The men swore they heard laughter, soft, childlike laughter, drifting between the trees. But every time they followed it, the sound would fade, leading them deeper into the thickets until they stood disoriented, lost among shadows. Near the old cemetery, another group stumbled upon something even more unsettling. Small footprints in the damp earth, leading directly between the graves. They followed the trail until it stopped abruptly in front of a cracked headstone. There, in the wet grass, lay a single daisy, fresh, its petals perfectly intact despite the chill of the season. No one could explain where it had come from, nor why Catherine's tracks ended there. As dusk fell, the search grew desperate. Lanterns flickered in the fog like ghostly eyes. Some men claimed to see Catherine standing at the edge of the fields, her dress pale, her hair drifting in the wind. But when they ran toward her, she vanished. One farmer swore he saw her smile, just for a moment, before dissolving into the mist. That night, the Doyle's house was filled with whispers. Neighbors who stopped by to comfort the family described an unbearable tension in the air. Eliza sat trembling at the table, clutching Catherine's doll, rocking it as though it were alive. Thomas remained silent, his face pale, his eyes hollow. And upstairs, on the wall of Catherine's room, they found something new, a drawing scratched into the plaster. It showed a girl holding hands with a tall, faceless figure. Both were smiling. The following morning brought no relief. The search expanded to the boglands, a place the townsfolk dreaded. The mud there was thick and treacherous, capable of swallowing a body whole. And it was there, at the edge of the bog, that they found Catherine's shoe, half buried in the muck, its laces torn. It seemed to suggest she had been pulled, or had stepped, into the mire. But no body surfaced. No clothing. No doll. Only the single shoe, as though left behind deliberately, a token to mark her disappearance. The whispers in town grew louder. Some said Catherine had been taken by spirits, lured away into the other world. Others believed she had been claimed by the bog, dragged beneath the surface where the drowned lay silent. A few whispered that she had not vanished at all, that she still wandered the fields at night, smiling, waiting for someone to follow her into the mist. The church bell tolled for days, but no funeral was ever held. Without a body, there could be no burial. And so Catherine's absence became a wound the town could not close. The photograph of her smiling face circulated in hushed curiosity, shown only in secret, as if speaking her name aloud might summon her back. The Doyles never spoke of her again. Eliza wasted away, her prayers unanswered, her eyes hollow with grief. Thomas withdrew further into silence, until one night he vanished as well, leaving only his chair by the fire. And the brothers. They grew into men who never smiled, their mouths drawn tight, their gazes haunted by the memory of their sister. The day Catherine vanished became more than an event, it became legend. A forgotten event woven into the dark history of the town, retold in whispers, embroidered with eerie details. A child who smiled when no one else did. A photograph that shouldn't exist. And a disappearance that left behind nothing but questions, fear, and silence. Yet even more disturbing were the accounts that came years later. People who claimed to see Catherine again, long after her disappearance, in places she could not possibly be, standing in windows, appearing in photographs of other families, always smiling. The disappearance of Catherine Doyle should have ignited a simple search, the kind towns had faced before when a child wandered too far into the woods or strayed too close to the bog. But what followed was not a rescue. It was a descent into silence, frustration, and fear. The constable, Patrick O'Rourke, was summoned to lead the investigation. A stern man, heavy with years of service, he carried himself with a sense of authority that once brought calm to the people. But when he stepped inside the Doyle home, he felt something that stripped away his confidence, a weight in the air, as though the house itself resisted his presence. He would later admit that it was the smell that unsettled him most. Candle wax, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like blood long dried. The investigation began with interviews. Eliza Doyle clutched her daughter's doll as if it might break apart if released. Her answers were fragmented, whispered between sobs. She smiled at me before she left. She said she would smile forever. O'Rourke asked her what it meant, but Eliza only shook her head, muttering prayers under her breath. Thomas Doyle was different. He refused to answer questions. He stared into the distance, eyes fixed on nothing. When pressed, he muttered, "She was chosen. You cannot stop what has already begun." That was all. Nothing more. The brothers fared no better. Samuel insisted he had been asleep. Daniel swore he hadn't seen Catherine for days, though neighbors had spotted them together in the orchard only the evening before. Their words contradicted each other, weaving a net of confusion rather than clarity. Next came the physical search. The constable ordered the bog dragged. Men sank their poles deep into the muck, but nothing surfaced. The woods were combed again. The cemetery turned over stone by stone. Even the river scoured. All in vain. No sign of Catherine. No clothing. No remains. No doll. Only silence and that one shoe, which seemed less like evidence and more like a cruel reminder. Then came the photograph. O'Rourke asked to see it, and reluctantly, Eliza produced the small print, worn from handling. At first, it was just as the townsfolk described. Catherine sitting stiffly, her strange smile glowing faintly on her pale face. But the constable noticed something others had not. Behind Catherine, in the blurred shadows of the backdrop, was a faint outline. A figure tall, indistinct, almost faceless. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but it remained. When he asked Eliza, who had been present during the sitting, she insisted Catherine had been alone. The photograph became the cornerstone of whispered speculation. Some believed it was nothing more than a trick of light, an imperfection in the developing process. Others swore it was proof, an image of the thing Catherine had drawn over and over in her childish sketches. The faceless figure that stood behind her, hand resting on her shoulder. Despite the growing unease, O'Rourke pressed on. He questioned townsfolk, following every lead. But the accounts grew stranger, more unreliable. A farmer claimed to hear Catherine's laughter in his fields at dusk. A seamstress said she saw her face reflected in her window, smiling at her from the dark. Children whispered that Catherine had joined the shadow people who wandered the cemetery at night. Every story added another layer of horror, but none brought him closer to the truth. Frustration turned to dread. O'Rourke returned to the Doyle home weeks later, determined to break through their silence. What he found unsettled him beyond words. The walls of Catherine's room were covered with new drawings, dozens of them. The faceless figure, looming larger now, standing over the small child who always smiled. Some of the sketches were smeared, as though drawn in haste, the pencil lines jagged and desperate. And in one, scrawled in shaky letters, was a phrase, "Smile forever." The investigation reached its breaking point when O'Rourke attempted to catalog the drawings. That night, he returned to the constable's office with them bundled under his arm. But by morning, the papers were gone. His desk was bare, his logbook missing. He swore he locked the door. No one believed him. From that moment, the town decided the case was cursed, and many whispered that O'Rourke himself had been marked for meddling where he should not. Within weeks, the investigation quietly dissolved. There were no more searches, no more questions, no more visits to the Doyle house. The constables stopped speaking of it entirely, retreating into silence much like Thomas Doyle himself. Some claimed he burned the photograph in his hearth, though others insisted they saw it years later, tucked into the drawer of his desk. Officially, Catherine Doyle's disappearance was marked as unresolved, unsolved, forgotten on paper, but not in memory. In truth, the case never reached a conclusion because no conclusion could be reached. There was no evidence, no body, no explanation. Only a child's smile, a photograph that should not exist, and a family drowning in secrets. The town moved on, or at least pretended to. But those who lived through it never forgot the unease, the whispers, the sense that something far larger, far darker, had taken place. Something no lawman could solve, no priest could banish, no family could conceal. Catherine Doyle was gone, and the investigation that should have saved her led nowhere, because perhaps she had never truly been lost. Perhaps she had only been taken. After the investigation collapsed, Catherine Doyle's story refused to fade. In fact, it grew. The absence of answers left a void, and into that void crept something far more powerful than facts. Whispers of the supernatural. The townsfolk could not speak her name without lowering their voices. Some swore Catherine had been taken by something not of this world. Others insisted she had willingly walked into its arms. What bound these stories together was the belief that her disappearance was not natural. It was something older, something darker, a mystery that no human investigation could ever solve. It began with the graveyard. For months after her vanishing, visitors claimed to see her figure drifting between the stones at dusk. At first, they thought it was a trick of the fog. But then came the details: her pale dress, her scuffed shoes, the tilt of her head, and always that smile. A smile that did not fade, even as her body blurred into mist. Children whispered that Catherine had joined the dead, that she played with them at night. They dared each other to sneak into the cemetery, and some claimed to hear her laughter echoing through the trees. One boy swore he saw her doll propped against a headstone, though when he reached for it, it crumbled into ash. The woods too became a place of unease. Hunters spoke of strange markings carved into the bark of trees, symbols they did not recognize, circles and lines that seemed to twist if stared at too long. Some believed Catherine had left them, guided by the same friend she always drew in her sketches. And deep within the thickets, people said they heard her voice, humming those backward nursery rhymes that once unsettled her neighbors. Even the Doyle home was not free of whispers. Visitors described cold spots that lingered in Catherine's room, as though unseen hands brushed against their skin. Candles refused to stay lit, and her mirror, still mounted above her dresser, was said to flicker with images of her face, smiling faintly in the glass before fading into nothing. But the strangest tales came from photographs. In the years that followed, families reported Catherine appearing in their portraits, not in full form, but faint, a pale outline, a blur with the hint of a grin. One family swore they saw her standing behind them in a Christmas photograph, her head tilted, her lips curved in that unnatural smile. They destroyed the image, burning it in the hearth, but claimed the smell lingered for weeks, a sharp, metallic odor, like blood. The clergy, desperate to calm the people, insisted these stories were nothing more than hysteria. They warned against forbidden language, claiming the child had been touched by something sinful, something drawn from whispered prayers the family should never have spoken. But the more they preached, the more the stories spread. Some said Catherine had become a walker between worlds, a child caught between the living and the dead, forever smiling because she could no longer feel fear. Others believed she had been claimed by the bog, but that the bog itself was haunted, a place where the drowned were not truly gone. They whispered that Catherine's spirit could lure the living toward the waters, her smile inviting them to follow her into the depths. As the years passed, Catherine's story became a kind of curse. Parents warned their children not to smile in photographs, fearing they might share her fate. The old image of Catherine, her unsettling grin, was kept hidden away, brought out only in hushed retellings, as proof of the town's darkest legend. And yet there were those who sought her out. The curious, the foolish, travelers who came after hearing whispers of the smiling child who had vanished. They wandered the fields at night, calling her name. Some claimed success. They said they saw her standing at the tree line, barefoot, her doll in hand. They said she beckoned to them. And though most escaped, shaken and pale, there were rumors that not all returned. The Doyle home eventually fell to ruin, abandoned after the family dissolved into silence and tragedy. But locals avoided the site. They said Catherine still lingered there, her presence strongest where her drawings once covered the walls. The house became a place of haunting, a reminder of the sinister past that had stolen a child from the world and left only shadows in her place. Catherine Doyle was no longer remembered as a missing girl. She became something else, a figure of dark history. a symbol of horror storytelling, a mystery no one dared to solve. And her smile, once the innocent gesture of a child, became an omen, because the whispers never stopped. Some believed they could hear her laughter even now, drifting on the wind through the orchards, soft and mocking. Others claimed that if you gazed too long at her photograph, her smile grew wider, her eyes darker, as if she was watching you, waiting. And then came the most unsettling belief of all, that Catherine had never left, that she had not vanished at all, that she still walked among them, hidden in plain sight, smiling at those who dared to look too closely. As the years slipped into decades, Catherine Doyle's story refused to rest. She was no longer merely a missing child. She became an echo, an unsettling presence stitched into the fabric of the town's memory. What lingered was not just her disappearance, but her smile. That unnatural, unnerving grin became her legacy, passed down in whispers, etched into warnings, feared by generations. For the children who grew up in the years after 1893, Catherine was a name spoken with dread. Parents used her story to keep them in line. Don't wander too far, or Catherine will take you. Don't smile at night, or Catherine will smile back. It was a cruel kind of bedtime story, a twisted piece of dark history that blurred the line between lesson and curse. The photograph, locked away by the Doyle family after their collapse, became almost mythical. Some claimed it resurfaced in private collections, passed hand to hand, hidden like contraband. The image was said to warp over time, the grin sharper, the eyes darker, the faint outline of that faceless figure behind her becoming more defined. Whether this was truth or superstition hardly mattered. What mattered was the belief that the picture itself carried the curse of Catherine's smile. By the early 1900s, her legend had grown beyond the town. Travelers carried the tale with them, spinning it into campfire stories, sermons, and cautionary warnings. In some versions, Catherine was a ghost wandering the graveyards, luring children to follow her. In others, she was a witch child, marked by forbidden language, taken by something she had called upon herself. But all the tales carried the same core. Catherine smiled, and then she vanished forever. The story began to influence behavior. Families grew fearful of post-mortem photography, once a common way to preserve the memory of loved ones. The practice, already unsettling, now seemed tainted by Catherine's legend. Some believed that capturing a smile in such an image would trap the soul. Others feared that any child who smiled in a photograph risked sharing Catherine's fate, lost in time, swallowed by shadows. Strange incidents only fueled the fear. In 1912, a family photograph taken in the next town over appeared to show Catherine standing faintly in the background, smiling her eerie smile. The photographer denied tampering with the plate, but the family destroyed the image within hours. Still, word spread. She had been gone for nearly 2 decades, and yet she appeared again. Other reports followed. A wedding portrait where a blurred figure seemed to lean over the bride's shoulder. A class photo where one child's grin stretched just a little too wide, her face eerily reminiscent of Catherine's. These images were quietly whispered about, never displayed. The townsfolk treated them not as photographs, but as warnings. Even those who never saw the picture spoke of Catherine's smile. It became shorthand for anything unnatural, anything too cheerful in the wrong place. A smile at a funeral, a laugh in a church, a grin that lingered when no joy was present. People said such things were signs that Catherine was near, watching, waiting. By mid-century, her story had transformed into a kind of folklore. Children dared each other to summon the smiling girl by whispering her name 3 times in front of a mirror. Farmers avoided the bog after dark, claiming Catherine's laughter still echoed through the reeds. And the old Doyle home, rotting, collapsing under its own weight, remained untouched, left as a scar on the land, a reminder of the family that had been consumed by shadows. But the most chilling part of Catherine's legacy was not the whispers, nor the photographs, nor the abandoned home. It was the belief that her smile could be inherited, that those who saw her photograph, or dreamed of her face, would carry a trace of it within themselves. Some claimed entire families grew silent, withdrawn, their children smiling in that same strange way, as if Catherine had reached through time to touch them. The legend of Catherine Doyle became a living thing, passed from lips to ears, etched into the bones of the town's memory. What began as one child's disappearance became an unsolved mystery, an unsettling history, a horror story retold for over a century. And through it all, one image endured. The photograph of a little girl smiling when no one else did. The legacy of the smile was not comfort. It was not joy. It was dread. Because a smile, once innocent, had been twisted into something sinister, something cursed, something that should never have existed. And as long as the story is told, Catherine Doyle smiles still, frozen in time, lost forever, her grin a reminder that some mysteries refuse to stay buried. The story of Catherine Doyle has no ending. That is its greatest horror. In 1893, a child smiled for a photograph, and days later she vanished. But she was never found. No body, no grave, no closure. What remains is not a conclusion, but a haunting, a wound in history that never healed. The Doyle family withered away under the weight of silence. Eliza faded into grief until she was little more than a shadow. Thomas walked into the night one evening and was never seen again. The brothers carried Catherine's absence like a curse, growing into hollow men whose eyes never softened, whose mouths never bent into smiles. Their home collapsed into ruin, but even in its decay, neighbors claimed to hear faint laughter drifting from its rotting walls. The photograph survived, passed in whispers, hidden in drawers, burned and yet reappearing in strange collections. A disturbing image of a little girl who should have been ordinary, but wasn't. Look closely at it, her pale face, her small frame, her eyes that seemed to follow you, and that smile. Sharp, unsettling, wrong. The photograph became more than memory. It became evidence. A key to an unsolved mystery. Proof of an unsettling history that no one dared fully confront. Some say Catherine's smile was never hers at all. That it belonged to something standing behind her. Something drawn into the image, captured in the shadows where the faceless outline lurked. Others believe she was marked by the practice of post-mortem photography, that her smile defied the era because she was already claimed by death. And still others whisper of forbidden language spoken in her home, words that opened a door that should never have been touched. No matter which version you believe, the conclusion remains the same. Catherine Doyle was lost in time, and her story lingers like a stain. She is no longer just a vanished child. She is a legend, a curse, a smile that should never have existed, but does. Even now, over a century later, the tales persist. Travelers claim to see her figure in the fog near the boglands. Families swear her face appears faintly in photographs, smiling when no one else is. And some who look at her picture too long insist it changes, the smile widening, the eyes darkening, as though Catherine herself is aware she is being watched. Perhaps she never left. Perhaps she is still here. The haunting that remains is not just in her story, but in the way it makes us question the things we trust most. A child's laughter, a family photograph, an innocent smile. All of these can be twisted into something darker, something sinister, something that lingers long after the child is gone. The mystery of Catherine Doyle is an unsolved one. It cannot be explained by reason, by law, or by faith. It rests instead in that liminal space between truth and legend, where the lines blur and shadows thrive. And that is why her story endures, because the unknown is the most terrifying thing of all. If you ever come across an old photograph, faded and forgotten, take care before you look too closely. At first, it may seem ordinary. But look again. Look carefully. If there is a child smiling when no one else is, step away. Do not linger. Some smiles are not meant for the living. Catherine Doyle smiled once, and perhaps she still smiles. Watching. Waiting. Forever. This was the story of Catherine Doyle, the child who smiled until she vanished forever. A fragment of dark history, an unsolved mystery, A chilling reminder that some photographs carry more than memory. They carry something alive. If you look long enough, perhaps you will see her smile again. But beware, because once she smiles at you, the haunting remains.